Hello, everybody. This is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, Part 1, Chapter 27. Levin's house was large and old, but though he lived there alone, he occupied and warmed the whole of it. He knew that this was ridiculous. He knew that it was bad and contrary to his new plans. But this house was a world of itself to him. It was a world where his father and mother had lived and died, and had lived a life which for Levin seemed the ideal of all perfection, and which he dreamed of renewing with his own life, with his own family. Levin scarcely remembered his mother, but this remembrance was sacred, and his future wife, as he imagined her, was to be the counterpart of the ideally charming and adorable woman, his mother. For him, the love of a woman could not exist outside of marriage, but he imagined the family relationship first, and only afterwards the woman who would be the center of this family. His ideas about marriage were therefore essentially different from those held by the majority of his friends, for whom it was only one of the innumerable actions of the social life. For Levin it was the most important act of his life, whereon all his happiness depended, and now he must renounce it. When he entered his little parlor, where he generally took tea, and threw himself into his armchair with a book, while Agafya Mikhailovna brought him his cup and sat down near the window, saying as usual, "But I'll sit down, Baitushka." Then he said, strangely enough, that he had not renounced his daydreams, and that he could not live without them. Were it Kitty or another, still it would be. He read his book and had his mind on what he read, and at the same time listened to the unceasing prattle of Agafya Mikhailovna. But his imagination was nevertheless filled with these pictures of family happiness which hovered before him. He felt that in the depths of his soul some change was going on, some modification arising, some crystallization taking place. He listened while Agafya Mikhailovna told how Prokhor had forgotten God, and instead of buying a horse with the money which Levin had given him, had taken it and gone on a spree, and beaten his wife almost to death. And while he listened, he read his book, and again caught the thread of his thoughts awakened by his reading. It was the book of Tyndall, on heat. He remembered his criticisms on Tyndall's satisfaction in speaking of the results of his experiences, and his lack of philosophical views, and suddenly a happy thought crossed his mind. In 2 years I shall have 2 Holland cows, and perhaps Pava herself will still be alive, and perhaps a dozen of Burkett's daughters will have been added to the herd. Splendid! And again he picked up the book. No, very good. Let us grant that electricity and heat are only one and the same thing. But could this one quantity stand in the equations used to settle these questions? No. What then? The bond between all the forces of nature is felt like instinct. When Pavina's daughter grows into a cow with red and white spots, what a herd I shall have with those 3! Admirable! And my wife and I will go out with our guests to see the herd come in, and my wife will say, "Kostya and I have been brought this calf up just like a child. How can this interest you so?" The guest will say, "All that interests him interests me also." But who will she be? And he began to think of what happened in Moscow. What is to be done about that? I am not to blame, but now everything will be different. It's foolishness to let one's past life dominate the present. One must struggle to live better, much better. He raised his head and sank into thought. Old Laska, who had not yet got over her delight at seeing her master, was barking up and down the court. She came into the room, wagging her tail and bringing the freshness of the open air, and thrust her head under his hand and begged for a caress, whining plaintively. "He almost talks," said Agafya Mikhailovna. "He is only a dog, but he knows just as well that his master has come home. It is sad." "Why sad?" "Da, don't I see it, Batushka? It's time I knew how to read my masters. Grew up with my masters since they were children. No matter, Batushka, with good health and pure conscience." Levin looked at her earnestly in astonishment that she so divined his thoughts. "Shall I give you some more tea?" said she, and she went out with the cup. Laska continued to nestle her head in her master's hand. He caressed her, and then she curled herself up around his feet, laying her head on one of her hind paws as a proof that all was arranged to suit her. She opened her mouth a little and let her tongue slip out between her aged teeth, and with a gentle puffing of her lips gave herself up to beatific repose. Levin followed all of her movements. "So will I," he said to himself. "So will I. All will be well."